It is the most wonderful time of the year, and I hoped that I would be producing more content over the last several weeks, but who knew that things could become so busy at this time of the year? It has been way too busy. Hopefully you are navigating the busyness well. Anyway, do you mind if I take a little bit of time and rant a bit? It is sure to get me into some trouble. Get your coffee. In my last video several weeks ago, I shared about my wife going to grad school for nursing back in 2018. When she started to talk about enrolling in grad school, I thought at that time, well, now is as good a time as any for me to do the same. And so I set out to enroll in grad school as well. I went to school to get a Master of Divinity degree. Now, I didn't go to seminary because I necessarily needed to. It wasn't actually necessary for my job. At the time that I enrolled in seminary, I had already been pastoring the church that I pastor for more than 10 years and had been in vocational ministry for nearly 20 years. In part, I think I enrolled in seminary because in some way, I needed to see if I could do it. I didn't go to college or university. I don't have an undergrad degree, but I discovered that it isn't always necessary or a prerequisite for grad school for you to actually have an undergrad degree. If you can meet some of the other requirements, you can actually get in, which is what I did. And I came into grad school under something that was kind of like an academic probation. I had to prove over the course of a couple semesters that I could meet the requirements of graduate level coursework. And lo and behold, I met the requirements and I completed my Master of Divinity degree earlier this year, back in May. Now, I didn't go to college or university out of high school because in reality, I didn't really do all that great in grade school. I did graduate from high school. I wasn't at the bottom of my class, but I certainly wasn't at the top either. I don't remember exactly what my high school grade point average was. It was above a 3.0, but it doesn't really matter. I didn't really like school. And that is most of the reason why I didn't go to college. I didn't like school. It didn't come easy for me like it does for some people. In fact, I think that's true for a lot of guys especially. You see, I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was in the 4th grade, and school was relatively difficult. I didn't read an assigned book all the way through high school. I made it through high school because I have a really good memory and I could remember just about everything that a teacher would lecture on, and I tested very well. But when I graduated from high school, I didn't really want to be in a school or academic environment any longer. So when I started seminary in 2018, high school being 20 years prior to that, that had been my last real academic experience, was during high school. So at 38, when I started grad school, I was kind of wondering whether or not I'd be able to do it. And let me tell you, school is quite a bit easier after you have lived life as an adult for 20 years. So I got high marks in every class in grad school. I got straight A's in every class except for one. And that one B kind of bothered me, because it wasn't because I didn't do the work in a class. I did do the work. But I could tell that the professor wasn't entirely happy with my view on some of the things from the coursework. The class was a class on counseling, and one of the required books in the class was a book called The Emotionally Healthy Church. Now, by the time that I took this counseling class, that book had been required reading in, I believe, 2 other classes. The Emotionally Healthy series of books, really, all from the same author, they have become something of like a mainstay for a lot of Protestant Christian circles in the US. And I think that some of the things in the book are good things, and some of the things in the author's other books are good things. But I have some issues with some of it as well, which I expressed in the class, which didn't really, shall we say, make the teacher think very highly of me. The author of these books was once a burned out pastor who had to reassess how he lived and worked because the way that he had been working had become unworkable. And I don't necessarily have an issue with that whole vantage point. There have been a lot of books that have been written on roughly the same topic. I think of R. Kent Hughes's book, Liberating Ministry from the Success Syndrome, or Paul Tripp's book, Dangerous Calling, or even Carey Nieuwhof's book, I think it's called I Didn't See It Coming. That subject on kind of burnout in ministry has been written on quite a bit. A lot of leaders experience some form of burnout, whether they're in business or they're in the nonprofit world or the church world. Burnout happens quite a bit, and people have to regroup. I've certainly had to rework unworkable, or shall I say, unsustainable aspects of the way that I live and work over time. I'm constantly having to reassess how I'm doing things and whether or not that's going to continue to work. And recently, I've had to do that again. I think that it is important that we try to become the best version of who we could be, which is some of what is talked about in the Emotionally Healthy series of books. We really need to become the person that God intends for us to be or desires for us to be. But my issue, which got me into some probably unnecessary wranglings with my professor and other classmates in that class, had to do with the focus on what is called emotional intelligence. Basically, I probably displayed low EQ by being dismissive of EQ, and it led to a low grade in the class. The theory of multiple intelligences arose in about the 1980s, and one of the things that has grown out of Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences is this whole discussion of emotional intelligence, or what is often referred to as EQ. Really, EQ draws from Gardner's ideas on intra and interpersonal intelligence. About a decade after Gardner's writings on multiple intelligences began to emerge, Daniel Goleman began writing on this issue of emotional intelligence. It began to surface in the literature. The basic idea is that a person with high emotional intelligence, or what is termed high EQ versus high IQ, this person will be more aware of other people's emotional states. They will be better at perceiving how their own actions and words and attitudes, their overall demeanor, how that affects people. Individuals with high EQ are said to be more empathic and compassionate. And more, you will see people promoting the idea that emotional intelligence, or EQ, is a better predictor of an individual's future success than IQ. At this point, let me say that I do think that being aware of how my actions and words and attitudes, how those things affect other people, is not a bad thing, especially as a husband and as a father. I have to be challenged on this with regularity. I'm not saying that other people's emotions and feelings are not a factor to consider as we live out our lives. Empathy and sympathy are more in line with the New Testament injunction to love your neighbor than is, say, apathy. The problem, as I see it, is that a person can become so empathic or work to be so empathic that they become borderline pathetic. But on the issue of emotional intelligence, the question posed by many critics of multiple intelligence theory and EQ seems to be valid. Does the literature on multiple intelligences in general and emotional intelligence specifically, does it reveal anything new that is not represented in personality theory? Or to say it a bit differently, is it not true that someone who displays high EQ, high emotional intelligence, being more sensitive and empathic to the emotional states of others, isn't that just really high trait agreeableness in their personality? Personality theory, especially as it relates to what's called five-factor analysis, or big five traits of openness and conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, it has proven to be a reliable metric in psychoanalysis and has a ton of support in the form of empirical research and data behind it. So we can determine, using psychometric assessments that an individual that is high in agreeableness or conscientiousness, that same person would be said to be high in emotional intelligence. They would have a high EQ. Why does any of this matter? Well, you could make the case that people that are high in conscientiousness and agreeableness, and then probably also high in neuroticism, meaning that they are highly affected by negative emotion, their own and others, those people are likely to be more perceptive of other people's emotional states and also more empathic and compassionate towards those people as well. In other words, they will be nicer. These people are easier to get along with. They have a high EQ. What is wrong with any of that? Well, here's where I have an issue with it and where I reveal my disagreeableness and maybe my low EQ. Literature, like that which is being prescribed in higher education, especially in the humanities and the liberal arts, which stresses the importance of having or increasing your EQ, becoming more emotionally healthy, it purports that high EQ is, shall we say, the right or the best or most essential trait for success. It promotes the idea that emotional intelligence, or EQ, is a better predictor of an individual's future success than IQ. So the question is it actually true that future leadership success requires high agreeableness? And actually, the answer to that question seems to be no from quite a bit of the literature. Over and over again, psychometric data has indicated that high achieving leaders, especially those of the entrepreneurial sort, are often very low in agreeableness. They are often rather impolite and not exactly compassionate or empathic. They tend to be very high in openness, being high in intellect and creativity, and they generally are conscientious in their own industriousness and their orderliness, but they don't tend to have a lot of compassion. Take, for example, Elon Musk or Steve Jobs before him. Steve Jobs created what is now the wealthiest company in history, and Elon Musk is, at present, I believe, still the wealthiest man in the world. How did they become or create what they did? Well, they are exceptionally low in agreeableness. They're very high in openness and exceedingly high in conscientiousness. I would imagine that both of them are, or were, because Steve Jobs is no longer with us, they're probably very low in negative emotion. Both have been accused of being arrogant and cavalier and mostly unaware and uncaring about how they are perceived and or how others feel as a result of their words, actions, or attitudes. Now, am I saying that we should aspire to be Elon Musk or Steve Jobs in our low EQ? I'm not really saying that, but I am saying that we shouldn't denigrate those who are, nor should we pathologize them as if there is something wrong with them. Somewhere along the way, we decided that the engineer or leader type personalities, which are often very low in EQ, that they are somehow disordered. And we typically label them with something like Asperger's, or we say that they are on the autism spectrum. Now, I'm not in any way asserting that autism isn't a real issue. It is, but not every person who is low in EQ, the engineer types, not every single one of them are on the spectrum. We need to recognize that if we say that such people are disordered and have some sort of mental issue, then we are going to cut off the highly productive, high-functioning entrepreneurial leaders in our society. If we rank order agreeableness at the top of the personality traits, believing that it is of supreme importance, then we predominate women over men who tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. And we further feminize men and separate out all of the people who are disagreeable, assertive, and creative. Elon and Steve, who needs them at that point? But what would the world be like without Musk and Jobs? We probably wouldn't have this stuff that I'm working to broadcast this from. My assessment is that HR departments are oftentimes very high in EQ, but the C-suite is not. And guess what? If you get rid of the C-suite, you don't have an HR department because you don't have a business. Disagreeable leaders are actually kind of important. Now, in saying all of that, I'm especially grateful that I have a very agreeable wife. She makes me, the disagreeable curmudgeon that I can tend to be, she makes me a whole lot better. So I don't want to get rid of the agreeable people. I need them in my life. But we need to recognize that God has designed that there are some disagreeable people as well. And we shouldn't pathologize disagreeableness or try to pacify the disruptors. Something to think about. We'll see you next time.